Hello, everybody. This is my second rather truncated talk to give some background to the trilogy in urban design that I wrote some years ago and to back up the publication of Understanding Cities. When I started to think about this, the task was quite huge because Sergio suggested that I talk a bit more specifically about the problem of social, economic, gender, and race inequalities as they manifest themselves in urban space and the importance of a transversal reflection. Now, I think that would take me a few days. So my comments are going to really have to be quite brief, and I'll try and make them to the point. It is rather a big subject, which was why I actually wrote the three texts. There's over 1,000 pages. Well, actually, I edited one and wrote the other two, which was 700 or 800 pages to get through. The subjects that I've been asked to talk about are clearly fundamental to urban design, and there's nothing in here about designing. And I think that's one of the essential properties of the books that I did, is that I'm not looking to try and change urban design by changing urban designers or what has been written about urban design in the past, but to reformulate the entire subject so that we look at it differently. It's not. I'm not trying to look at it the same way that it has been looked at from the last 50 years. I think that really is today is a bit of a waste of time. I owe my intellectual position to many people on these particular subjects. In fact, I have the Understanding Cities here, and I just want to read very briefly where I'm acknowledging where my own stimulus has come from. I mean, I'm not original in the sense that my knowledge is derived from others, and I say that I have looked at the leadership of people like Alan Scott, Manuel Castells, Jean Baudrillard, Mark Godiner, Rob Creer, Tariq Ali, Franz Fanon, Roland Barthes, Pierre Bourdieu, Manfredo Tafuri, Aldo Rossi, many people who have been directly involved in architecture or planning or social theory, but also having solace and inspiration from many great writers, some of whom are from South America. I've read people like George Siebold, Tim Winton, Salman Rushdie, John DeLillo, Pat Barker, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Mario Vargas Llosa, Ian Rankin, and many more who I call great friends who I've actually never met. And it goes on from there. I mean, when I look at my bookcase, I have very few books on urban design at all. Very few. And the ones that I do have are focused on trying to understand not just urban design, but the fundamentals of social systems. For example, one of the obvious questions here is the fundamental system basically and originally the material production of life? Or in fact, is it, as Habermas has suggested, the creation and use of language? Because we always talk about abstract thought, and there's no such thing as abstract thought. We have to think using language. We have to have our concepts formulated in words before we can use them. And so when I did my PhD at London School of Economics, it was basically on the idea that we know how economic structures create spatial structures. But the question is, how do ideological structures create spatial structures? because at that time I worked in Hong Kong. I've worked in the United States and Greece and Britain, Hong Kong, Australia, and one or two in Indonesia as well. My wife is Balinese, and so the whole focus of my learning has been basically international, and but also using this idea where I had done my PhD at London School of Economics on ideological structures. How do ideological structures create spatial structures? And the reason for that was that I was in a colonial environment that had been ruled and administered by Britain for something like 150 years. And I could see very clearly that there was this huge clash of ideological systems. Also in the way in which space was allocated. Clearly interested in space as an urban designer. And the legal system, it got down to basically how the legal system reflected business interests and colonial interests and did not actually take into account, really in any way, the needs of the majority of the population, who were Chinese, of course, 5 or 6 million Chinese, most of whom couldn't access the legal system because they couldn't read English. And so the ideological system of business and commerce that really was the driving force in Hong Kong came down to how the spatial system was used to create wealth. And that was the fundamental in how urban design in Hong Kong came about. And there's so many lies about how it happened and misread interpretations, etc. The argument has always been in Hong Kong for this phenomenal high density that there wasn't enough land. Well, it's not actually true. Everybody knows that if you can reproduce land in the city centre or close to the centre or close to urban areas, it's worth 10 times as much as it is in the country. So the concentration of development around the harbour in Hong Kong was really, excuse me, a political act driven by an ideology of colonialism and imperialism. The whole economic system, of course, came out of that. But one of the things that I also learned there, I've been asked to say a few words on the idea of gender and race. And from my perspective, the whole concept of demeaning women or not considering women as equals is anathema. I just don't get it. That women must be. It's not. I mean, even my words are saying this must happen. I feel like I'm supposed to be in control of some of this, but I don't want to be in control of it. I just think equality should pervade all societies. And of course, that doesn't happen, but we can try our best to promote it. And the same thing with race. One of the things I learned when working in Hong Kong was that when I went there, I always thought that race was something that white people did to everybody else. And I found very quickly that when I went to Hong Kong, this wasn't actually true, because I think that most cultures are racist. It's a kind of natural defense system that they have. And all that we can do really is to try our best to overcome the tendencies in our own culture for that kind of behavior, because I think it's really abhorrent to look in any sense social systems as racialized and gendered. And one of the things that, again, reflecting back on Hong Kong, that I discovered was that it's also rooted in language. I mean, in Hong Kong, the polite word for foreign is Loi Guok Yan. And the commonly used term by local Chinese people is Guailu, which means ghost person or devil person. And I always find it quite insulting, although I did I was assured by my colleagues that it wasn't, that it was just that's how we do things. But that's how we do things is how countries and territories end up um, with attitudes, generalized social attitudes that create principles that we really don't want to encourage. The race question is the gender question is similar, and I think that if there's anything missing, uh, one of the questions that I've always been asked is that why don't I have a question on a section on gender in the books that runs across all three paragraphs? And my basic principle has always been that race and gender and inequality are products of the capitalist and most of the Western world, the products of the capitalist system. And so I didn't want to select one out over the others, although I have gender, of course, infuses the book. And we can see how all urban space has been gendered in the past. It has been, there are class distinctions in how space is allocated, there are gender distinctions in how space is used, and there are race distinctions in how zoning occurs in cities, either directly or indirectly. And these are all the kinds of issues that I really think that urban designers should be looking at. And I think that the idea of gender and race are absolutely fundamental and obscured. And I think that we should, if I had the time, I think I'd do another book on precisely those two subjects, gender and race. But given my age, I think I'll leave that to somebody else at the moment. But I do feel that I don't know where it comes from. It must be some kind of deep Freudian structure that, in some manner, has to see women as inferior. And I actually think the opposite. I think that in terms of the species, that women are superior creatures. I think that they think and feel and act in ways that men simply can't understand. And I think that we should be prepared to deal with urban space from an urban design perspective that accommodates as much as we can women in positions of authority, where space has been allocated and used in accordance with with women's needs to raise families, to live in a particular kind of way, and to have habits indulged. So the overall principles, I think if I had to go back and start at the beginning of this little chat, is that I think that we need to read very widely. I think that all of our knowledge must be informed from the best sources. I don't think that we can talk about, urban designers can talk about gender without having read, a half a dozen serious books on the subject. They can't talk about class distinctions in space without having read people like Alan Scott, David Harvey, Mark Godiner, and people like that. And so there is this vast residue of information that I think never appears in urban design programs in any country that I know about. There are fragments here and fragments there, but I don't think it's really penetrated at all. And of course, in line with if we reorganized urban design programs on the lines of the books that I've written, which could accommodate the entire program, then we would be looking at very different people coming out of those courses that were not dominated largely by architects and planners. And in fact, at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, where I'm still emeritus professor, we always tried to have a variety of disciplines. The urban design program was open to lawyers, social scientists, architects, planners, and a diversity of people who are actually fundamentally involved in the urban design process. And I think that to a certain extent, that the urban design process needs to really have many fewer architects working on it and a great many more social scientists. I know this actually happened to a certain extent in Britain, like say 40 years ago, 40 years ago, where there was a revolution in urban planning, where the membership was 90% architects, shifted quite radically to almost 50-50 planning dominated by social scientists. But this conflict between planning and architecture as to who owned urban design is really the principle that I've been trying to set to the side. That urban design, in my book, has its own integrity, it has its own theoretical object, and it has its own real object. And from those points of view, and in the books, one of the books I explain this, that if we can argue that urban design has greater integrity than either architecture or urban planning to, in a sense, be involved in the creation of urban space, because architecture has a real object, of course, buildings, but it doesn't have a theoretical object. Urban space or architectural space or something that's too flaky. The same with planning. Planning is a servo mechanism of the state. And so planning has neither a theoretical object or a real object. It can't have it because as I say, it's a servo mechanism. It's a product. And the real force is how the state is constructed. Now, we need to know all these things in order to act appropriately. So I think I've just gone over my 15-minute limit, and I hope that this is sufficient for you. And thank you again for listening. And I hope that you're able to get a hold of one of these copies of Understanding Cities. And if you can, and if you can read English, please get the other two as well. Thank you for listening. Bye.